Story number 1. The Horse. This story comes from no other than the person you're hearing right now, myself. I had quite the cannabis habit. I would smoke every day for months on end. But one day, around 7 months into my cannabis binge, I decided enough was enough, and I had stopped. From this point on, life started to get better, I started to feel happier, and I was using it less and less. You may be wondering why you need to know this to understand this story. Well, the events of this night all take place because I went out to smoke with one of my friends before he moved away for college. Now I was around a month clean at this point, but smoking was just something my friend group did, and I surely wanted to enjoy one last time with my friend before he left, so that's what we did. Me and a few of my friends, including the friend who moved away, all got together to smoke weed. Now my other friends, they kept smoking every single day, so I was obviously way more high than them. Anyways, it was getting late at this point, around 11 p.m., and so we all made our ways back home. My friend had driven my car back to his house around 30 minutes away because I still didn't feel okay to drive. After he got out of my car and went into his house, I got into the driver's seat and I decided to pull out of his house. Now everything was going smoothly at this point and I was definitely alert enough to drive. So I'm a few miles down from his house at this point and the road takes a sharp left. So naturally, I turn my car with the road and I see a ton of flashing lights. Shit. At first I assumed it was cops or something, maybe they had set up a checkpoint, and at this point I started to get a little worried. Sure, I was fine to drive and everything, but my eyes were still red like hell. So I'm driving up to whatever these flashing lights are and I get a little closer and I proceed to see somebody doing CPR to somebody else on the road. Nope. At this point I decided to back my car up because I assumed there was an accident and EMS was already there. As I'm reversing my car, I take a double take and I realize that there is no EMS. The flashing lights I was seeing was hazards on somebody's car, and to the side of the road, a truck with its hazards and brights on. So I pull my car over and park in a ditch, really the only place I could park on this road, and I get out. I walk up to the truck first as it was closer to my car. There's a man on the phone. I look back down the road and I still see the same guy performing CPR on an unconscious person. I signaled to the guy near the truck, who I was standing next to at this point, and asked him if he wanted me to call the police. He very frantically shook his head. And I did just that. I called 911 and at first they couldn't hear me. As they're trying to get an answer out of me, repeatedly asking if I'm there, I hear the man performing CPR on the unconscious guy say, "You're my best friend. Come on, you can't leave me like this." At this point I'm screaming at the operator on the other end, and yet they still can't hear me. So finally they hang up the call and I'm in absolute rage. They call me back and finally they can hear me, and I explain the road I'm on and that there appears to be an unconscious man and somebody doing CPR on him. After this occurs, I hang up the phone and me and the guy in the truck and his wife start walking up to the person doing CPR on the unconscious body. As we're walking, he tells me that he was from a city around an hour away from us and that he was only in my town to celebrate a certain type of festival. We live in Louisiana, so having festivals over shrimp and seafood and stuff like that is kind of commonplace here. So we walk up, and I'm about a foot away from this guy doing CPR on the unconscious body. We try to ask him what's up, and that's when I look up and I see his car totally demolished. I'm surprised the hazards even worked on the car with all the damage that had been done to it. He starts rambling frantically, in a panic. He mentions something about a horse, but at this point it's just too hard to understand what he's saying. He's clearly getting tired at this point, and he asked me to switch out with him. So I did. I get on top of this unconscious body, put my hands on his chest, and start performing compressions. All while his friend is saying, 1, 2, 3, 4, stay in a line, stay in a line. Whatever little bit of high I was feeling on the drive back left me at this moment. I felt completely sober. I don't know if it was the adrenaline or what, but even that tired feeling that you get towards the end of the high whenever you're not really high anymore off weed, that wasn't there either. I was just fully alert. It's kind of hard to explain. The man's body who I was performing compressions on was very badly injured. His entire chest appeared to be sideways at a 45-degree angle, and there was what looked to be bloody pieces of pulp all over him. As I'm looking at his face, I realize there's dried blood that had already dried out that came out of his mouth. The man at this point begins to explain what happened. He was driving his car down the road with his friend in the passenger seat when a horse ran out and struck their car. By this point, we had already switched out of doing the compressions a couple times, and I'm looking at his car and I realize that his side is not nearly as badly damaged as the passenger side. I think what had happened was that the horse hit the car and slid into the passenger side and then flew out the top after. It would explain all of that bloody pulp stuff that was all over the guy I was doing compressions on, but I can't really be sure. A police officer was the first one to arrive to the scene. He switches out with me and starts doing compressions on the guy. Then eventually he gets tired and he switches out with the driver who had gotten in the car accident. Then, a short while later, the fire department are the next people to arrive. They come out and they're hooking up some sort of machinery to him and checking his pulse, which there's none. I don't really know what overcame me, but seeing all this, I just screamed out "fuck" really loud. Then finally, an ambulance arrives. They're carrying out a stretcher and some other stuff they needed to check his vitals. A paramedic starts trying to perform CPR on him, and after a while they realize it's not working. Now the stretcher was back around 6 or 7 feet from them, and I was standing right next to it. "Bring it here," one says. I didn't really react, and he says it again a little bit louder. So I realized he was talking to me. I grab the stretcher and I bring it close to them. Then we all coordinate how we're gonna pick up his body, and me, these paramedics, the fire department, and this police officer all help pick up his body and put him on the stretcher. When people are involved in these kind of accidents, it's very complicated the way you have to move them, because moving them just a slight bit can give them lifelong injuries, so I understood why we all had to help. Well, after they got him onto the stretcher, they moved him back into the ambulance and they drove away. The cop asked for my name alongside the guy and his wife who were in the truck. We respectfully give him our names, and he thanks us, and he tells us to wait for the sheriff department to get there so they can decide what to do with us. He said they may have needed a statement or something. Then, a short while later, a sheriff's officer pulls up in her car. She gets out, she talks to us, grabs our names, and then asks for the story. We tell her what the guy had said to us frantically and how he had explained that a horse had hit their car, and then me, this man and his wife, and the sheriff start all looking around for this horse. There are a few more police officers at this point, and everybody's just looking for this horse. So me, the wife, the husband, and the sheriff were walking around, and we see a large dark object in a ditch. The sheriff's officer clicks her flashlight on to look at whatever was in this ditch, and there it was, a giant dead horse. She then looks back at us, shines a flashlight at our feet because we were all standing near this ditch, and she says, "Y'all might not want to stand there." I look down, and there's just a ton of horse pulp and guts everywhere. After that, we were free to go, and still very freaked out, I called one of my friends to tell him what had just happened to me. I get home, I washed my ring off on my finger, which still had a little bit of dried pulp or blood on it or something. Then I went to bed. This experience kind of messed me up for a few days, but after I was able to recover from it and move on. The last thing I did was find the person's Facebook, who I was helping give compressions to his friend, and gave my condolences. He had plans for me. So yesterday I was at my sister's house with my mom, watching my son and nephews play in the yard. One of my nephews, Harrison, was picking bark off a tree, and I remembered an odd encounter I had as a kid. I said, "So weird," out loud, thinking about the encounter. My mom, of course being nearby, heard this and asked me what I was thinking about. So I told her. When I was a kid, I was hanging out at Pinecone Forest, which is what the neighborhood kids would call a small patch of trees on the side of the road. I was picking bark off of one of the trees to pass some time, waiting for my friend Frankie to finish his homework to come out and play. Out of nowhere, it seemed, a guy came up to me. I could smell him before I saw him. He reeked of stale cigarette smoke. I was kind of afraid when I looked at him. He wasn't very old, but he had a very lazy eye that was cloudy, and his teeth and fingernails were stained yellow. My mom taught me to be nice to people, even if they don't look like me. So I faked a smile and said hello. "What are you doing?" he asked me. The smell of his breath was the worst. I'm picking the bark off this tree." "You shouldn't do that. It's like picking off the tree's skin. How would you feel if someone picked off your skin?" he said while lightly pinching my arm with his sharp yellow nails. "I don't know," I replied and took my arm back. Just then, Frankie's mom called for me out the door and told me to come wait inside. I didn't think anything of the whole thing at the time, and when I told my mom about it, she had this look of, I don't know, guilt maybe? She said it's probably time I know the whole story. She had thought I forgot about the whole encounter, so she never brought it up to me. Firstly, you should know that the neighborhood I grew up in is a tight-knit community. There's also not very many people in our neighborhood either. Everyone knew everyone, and there was no reason for an outsider to come unless they knew someone there. Anyway, here's what happened with this guy. Frankie's mom, Sonia, noticed a white van with no windows parked on the side of the road. She didn't recognize it but figured maybe it was a visitor for a neighbor. Sonia said, or rather told the police, that the van had been there all morning and afternoon. She was kind of keeping an eye on it. She said she just had a very bad feeling about the whole thing. Her house had a huge window in the front facing the Pinecone Forest, and the van was parked right next to it. She saw me waiting for Frankie and kept a constant eye on the van while holding the phone just in case. She saw the man exit the back of the van, walk up to me, and as soon as she saw him grab my arm and pinch me, she called the cops. And then shortly after that was when she called me back into her house. The cops stopped the guy just outside of my neighborhood. In the back of his van were binoculars, a Polaroid camera, and pictures of me taped all over the walls and ceiling. Me at school, my grandparents' house, at the bank with my mom, just me everywhere I went. But that's not all. He had a key to a storage unit on him. Inside the unit they found a cabinet full of knives. A lot of knives. Paring knives, a butcher cleaver, a thin fillet knife, a melon baller, and just various knives of all shapes and sizes. There was also a few anatomy books, surgical equipment, duct tape, and 10 empty 5-gallon buckets. In the middle of the unit was an old bed that was used to restrain mental patients, so it had wrist and ankle straps. The entire inside of the unit was covered in plastic wrap. My mom said that he was in a high-security mental institution for the criminally insane, last she heard. So the whole thing's pretty creepy to me, and I figured I'd share my story. The office in the middle of nowhere. When I was 19, I worked for a company that allocated labor to rural areas of Australia. Basically, what you did was you'd tell them when you were available, and they'd send you to a remote farm for a few weeks where you'd go and do whatever they needed done. It was hard work and long hours, but the pay was good, and as long as you had some friends around you, it wasn't that bad of a job. When this occurred, I was working on a large property. I was told it covered roughly the same landmass as the state of Maryland in the United States. About 9 hours from Sydney City, and the property itself was around 40 minutes from the nearest town. In short, it was in the middle of nowhere. I was working at a farm cleaning brushland with 3 other guys my age from the city. Our boss was a guy named Jeremy who owned the farm and supervised us while helping out with the work. He was pretty laid back and was generally really good to us. This summer in particular was very hot, and the work was hard. So one day when the temperature hit around 38 degrees Celsius, around 100 Fahrenheit, Jeremy decided to give us the afternoon off. He said he knew of a waterhole on the farm, about a 25-minute drive north. I was very keen for a swim, but the other guys just wanted to relax for the arvo. So him and I hopped in one of the work trucks and started heading across the property. It was mostly wide, empty expanses with a few clumps of scattered brushland. Jeremy wasn't much of a talker, so we drove more or less in silence. After about 20 minutes, however, he suddenly perked up and jabbed me in the ribs. "Did you see that over there? Beneath the 2 dead trees?" I should mention here that if you're not familiar with inland areas, particularly those in Australia, they are brown or red, and mostly flat and bland, meaning any bright colors stick out like a sore thumb. So you can imagine our surprise when we could see a large blue angular structure far off in the distance. We steered in its direction, and as we got closer we realized it was a huge blue shipping container just sitting in the middle of nowhere. Jeremy was perplexed. I asked him if he knew what it was, but he obviously didn't. He said he hadn't seen it when we drove through the same area around 5 weeks before, but he wanted to go and check out what it was. Initially, we pulled to a stop about 100 meters away from it. At this stage, I had a really bad feeling. The whole thing wasn't right. It's hard to explain, but if you can imagine seeing such a foreign object in the middle of a huge barren expanse, yeah, it was definitely something weird. Jeremy, however, wanted to investigate, which I completely understood, given it was his property, but in truth, I was really anxious. As we got closer, things seemed more bizarre. There was a big diesel generator behind it thumping away, and a CCTV camera on each side. Both the cameras seemed motion activated, so they all buzzed from side to side, following us as we moved around. I tried to reason with Jeremy, something along the lines of, "With all this security, someone obviously doesn't want us here. Let's just go." He brushed me off, however, reminding me that it was his farm and whoever had put this here was trespassing, so he wanted to go inside. Despite all the surveillance, there was only a small padlock on the huge door. We had some bolt cutters in his toolbox, and after a bit of a struggle, we broke the lock and went inside. The first thing I noticed was a rush of cold air as we got in. The place was air conditioned, which I must admit was quite pleasant on such a hot day. We searched around for a light switch, but I could already see this was some sort of IT setup. There were flashing LEDs all around the place, and the sort of hum you hear when a hard drive is working hard. When we finally switched on the lights, we could see a sophisticated, albeit somewhat cluttered, office setup. There were hard drives the size of bar fridges, and other computer equipment lining the walls, sometimes piled 2 or 3 high, and plastic storage boxes scattered around the far wall, and several desks with computer monitors arranged in the middle, complete with rolling office chairs. At this stage, I felt like I was in one of those nonsensical dreams. This made absolutely no sense. We wandered to the middle and sat down at the desks to see if the computers could give us any idea of what the hell was going on here. My heart was racing and I honestly just wanted to bolt. We had been seen by the CCTV, so if anyone was monitoring us, they already knew we were here. Jeremy, on the other hand, was adamant that we had to get to the bottom of this, so I put on a brave face and started looking through the computer. This went on for a while, but in short, neither of us had had a very high grasp of technology outside of Facebook and Microsoft Word. The best I can describe it from my lay position is that it was an endless list of computer talk. On the computer screen, there looked to be some sort of program that looked similar to Napster or LimeWire. You know, just some sort of downloading program. Just constantly picking up and receiving data, then recording it on several windows. I gave up on the computers and walked cautiously over to the far end of the container, to a big pile of storage boxes. By then I was pretty sure no one else was there, as there was nowhere to hide really, but I was still incredibly on edge. I decided against my better judgment to see what was inside all these boxes. My brief sift through these boxes made me feel sick to my stomach. It didn't take long for me to realize that these boxes were full of posters, DVDs, and photos. All of hardcore, let's just call it cheese pizza. One thing that gets to me is that it was all neatly ordered into folders and smaller boxes. These people were organized. I immediately recoiled, jumped up, and ran over to Jeremy. I could hardly string a sentence together. I said something to the effect of, "Mate, get out. Child, go. Get the fuck up." I dragged him out, composed myself, and managed to explain what I saw. We jumped back into the truck and sped back to the house. The farm had no mobile phone reception, and we hadn't brought the satellite phone, so we had to get back to the landline and call the police. Once we called them, they still had to make it all the way to the farm from the nearest police station, which is in a town around half an hour from the town closest to the farm. As I mentioned, we were in a very remote place. We waited, talking frantically about what we'd seen, until the cops arrived almost an hour later. They arrived with 2 4-wheel drives, and we jumped in and led them back. This is where things get worse. By the time we got back, the container door was open and there was a fire inside. We only had 2 extinguishers in the car, and these did very little. The fire department took an hour to get there, by which stage most of the damage was already done. An arson report by the federal police found almost no evidence of the computer equipment described, and only traces of paper and cardboard. This means that whoever ran this operation knew we were there and had time to come and remove most of it and get away. There were various ways to get off the property, and the landmass was absolutely huge, so there was no real way to tell them. Since the police hadn't taken all of us too seriously in the first instance, probably due to the poor explanation on the phone, aerial surveillance was also impossible by the time we had pieced it all together. I took a keen interest in following it up, but with no real evidence of who may be responsible, the investigation went cold. I kept my contact with Jeremy, and the shipping container is still sitting there on the farm, as it's way too expensive to move. I'll never forget about what I saw in those boxes.